Now, our theme this week is revival of the fittest. And there are many wonderful things to say about Downton Abbey. Its cast, its production values, so many things about it for which it's won many awards and worldwide acclaim. But I want to bring up the fact that it is reviving a long-standing tradition in particularly English fiction, the tradition of historical fiction. And I want to explore with you this evening how Downton Abbey uses the most classic conventions of historical fiction to tell its story. And it does so, of course, by making sure that it chooses settings that have deep, deep histories of their own. You see here Highclere Castle in the county of Hampshire, which is actually south of London, and it is standing in for Downton Abbey, which is supposed to be in Yorkshire, north of London. But of course, so much attention has been attracted to Highclere Castle itself and to Lord and Lady Carnarvon, its owners, that now there are books out about the history of that place too. So when you start getting historical, even with the settings used for Downton Abbey, it opens up the history of those places themselves. And it's important as we think about historical fiction and its relation to Downton Abbey that we recognize that it has a literary history and a television history behind it as well. Really, when you think about Downton, it has many debts. Its greatest debt, I think, in terms of design, is to the Victorian novel. The great big omnibus Victorian novels such as Charles Dickens' Bleak House or George Eliot's Middlemarch that tell all kinds of stories within the same community. Stories of working class people, stories of struggling middle class people, stories of aristocrats, and how they intermix, and how some go off on stories of their own for a while and then come back to the main mix. Some of those novels also deliberately bring in historical detail, such as Middlemarch, which is really about a time that is a kind of a Middlemarch as well as a place. But Downton Abbey filters all of that through the ancestry that it gets from the British television series from the BBC, Upstairs, Downstairs, which ran originally from 1971 to 75 and brought in history a great, great deal, especially in its marvelous World War I season, and then was revived recently for 2 seasons in 2010 to 12, although it's been somewhat eclipsed in that revival by Downton Abbey itself. And this whole idea got revived in interest, the whole upstairs, downstairs world of the estate, bringing it out from London, as it was in Upstairs, Downstairs, to a country estate. In the film Gosford Park, released in 2001, directed by Robert Altman, but written by Julian Fellowes, who won the Academy Award for that screenplay and soon became the creator and the chief writer of Downton Abbey. Who incidentally has been elevated 3 years ago to the peerage and is now a member of the House of Lords. And he hails from a background that combines the upstairs and the downstairs. So he indeed knows of what he speaks, although he himself insisted on hiring an etiquette expert from that time to make sure that all the proper etiquette of the house was maintained upstairs and downstairs. A lot of history there, therefore. But I want to talk about how Downton Abbey, with all those traditions contributing to it, really tries to follow the classic tendencies of the masters of historical fiction. Historical fiction as a phenomena, that is, fiction trying to have its historical facts quite accurate while it interweaves fictional characters and situations with them, goes back well into the 18th century. But it became prominent worldwide, and certainly in the English-speaking world, because of 2 prominent authors in the early 19th century. Sir Walter Scott, who first started writing historical poetry, but when he discovered that had too limited an audience, expanded to the historical novel with Waverley in 1814. And from 1814 all the way until his death in 1832, he wrote one historical novel after another, many of which are still famous today. He started with historical novels that dealt with just a century before, and with the struggles between Scotland and England in the 18th century. but gradually he migrated back to the Middle Ages itself, starting with perhaps his most famous novel, Ivanhoe, in 1820. And he filled the backs of those books with additional notes and historical facts, just to make sure that you knew that the facts that he claimed were actually grounded in thorough research that could be documented from other books. His American counterpart, James Fenimore Cooper, was not always that thorough, but he unquestionably attempted the same level of historical and fictional interplay with as much accuracy to known history as he could muster. He's most famous for the series of 5 novels, best known as the Leatherstocking Tales, that follow the character Natty Bumpoo all the way from being the young deer slayer to the old pioneer guide near the end of his life. And the most famous in that series of novels is The Last of the Mohicans, published in 1826, that takes place right in the midst of the French and Indian War and involves the fictional characters in actual battles, retreats, and deaths that took place. Now, they set a standard which has been followed by a great many authors. Now, some authors, some filmmakers do historical fiction, and they don't necessarily follow these standards. They don't necessarily follow what I would call the rules of classic historical fiction. Now, these are not legal rules. They're conventions, and authors can choose to violate them. But Downton Abbey has made the decision, as a lot of successors of Scott and Cooper have, to maintain these rules as a matter of convention and make sure the audience knows that we expect that, and we count on that, episode after episode and novel after novel. I mean, Quentin Tarantino, for example, feels free to violate these all the time, right? You're watching Glorious Bastards, and it's very interesting, but you know, now we know that Hitler gets blown up in a theater. Well, he's deliberately cheeky, and you can respect that, and he's just taking these conventions and sending them up and blowing them up as he goes. Downton Abbey adheres to the rules of classic historical fiction, and I would summarize them as these 4 principally. First, you should put fictional characters into historical realities that seem to be realities that the reader believes, even though there's a lot of fiction involved. But you must not change known history. Now, of course, there's a lot of unknown history, things that we don't know that happened behind closed doors and in parts of battles or sieges or sea voyages that we don't have any record of. Well, the author is free to suggest possibilities there because there's no known history to contradict it. But the convention is you don't violate known history. Now, sometimes what we know as history changes, but as far as what was known at the time, say Sir Walter Scott wrote, he didn't think he violated known history ever. Number 2, you should fill the eye and ear, as Scott certainly did, with local color or details of the story's time and places, so as to immerse your readers and characters in that world as though they are there. And that was a key for Scott for maintaining what his contemporary, the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, called the willing suspension of disbelief. Of course, we come to a fiction thinking, well, this is fiction. We're not going to believe it, but we choose, because we are so drawn in that world, to suspend our disbelief and feel as if we are immersed in that world because it has been so completely rendered to us, and we therefore identify with many of the key characters as though we were them. It helps, rule number 3, and Scott certainly made a lot of this, as did Cooper, if there are connections of fictional beings to actual events, yes, but it's even more convincing is there is some presence or mention of actual historical people, structures, or landmarks, so that you can feel like you yourself actually met somebody important. Scott had a famous strategy of making you wonder whether you would ever meet someone actually historical, and then using them in disguise for much of the story until at the end they reveal themselves as some important historical person. A famous instance of that in Ivanhoe is the Black Knight, who rescues Ivanhoe after he's wounded and turns out to be King Richard the Lionhearted himself, unexpectedly returned from the Crusades. In Scott's The Talisman from the 1820s, about the Crusades itself, a figure who seems to be a kind of prophetic beggar from the Muslim side who finds his way into the English camp, turns out to be the man they regard as their chief enemy, Saladin himself. And there ends up being a dialogue between King Richard and Saladin themselves, who are actually historical figures, although we don't know what they said necessarily in those scenes. But there's been a long-running battle in literary studies between fiction and history, because some would say, well, fiction's a lie, and it pretends to be historical truth, and we ought not to believe lies. History is somehow truer. But as far back as Aristotle's treatise, The Poetics, which was really a series of lecture notes that his students back in ancient Athens wrote down in 330 BC, Aristotle makes a connection between the history that is talked about in ancient Greece and fictions such as Greek tragedies and epics. And for him, fiction, unlike history, aims for universal significance. It makes us identify with people who might be fictional, might be real, back in a certain time, and so the significance of what happens to them is also significant for what happens to us now. The significance lasts across time, and therefore fiction is universal. It tends to pick up on universal human tendencies that stand the test of time, whereas history is only about, he said, particular instances at particular times, after which everything else changes. That's why there are usually parallels between an historical fiction and the time at which it is composed, read, or viewed. There's a kind of a dialogue going on of now with then that allows the audience to feel both some reflection of what's happening to them now, but also some comfort about it because, well, these things were happening back then. But at the same time allows us to escape long ago and far away and maybe not have to face these problems so directly. It's a complex effect that lies behind the entertainment that we receive from these historical fictions. I mean, Scott may have written about medieval times in Ivanhoe, where the Normans from France and the Anglo-Saxons from England were in a kind of uneasy truce and half-war with each other. But to him, that was the parallel between the conflicts between the native Britons, the Scots, and the Irish, trying to form a community in the early 19th century. So that history back in medieval times is very much in dialogue with the history and feelings of his own times, and he invites the audience to reflect on those parallels, thus making fiction more universal than history itself. And I think Downton Abbey tries to operate in very much the same way. Now, I want to point out some major historical events that Downton Abbey uses. And I've chosen these because all of them have a significance in the end, by the way they're used in Downton Abbey, beyond merely the historical events themselves, thus establishing that kind of universality that Aristotle talks about. First, there is the really broad significance, beyond itself, of the sinking of the Titanic on April 15th, 2012. And that is the historical event that really begins Downton Abbey in season 1. I mean, the plan is, by Lord and Lady Grantham, that their eldest daughter, Lady Mary, is going to marry the man on whom the estate has been entailed. Those of you who've read Jane Austen know an awful lot about entails, because there was a habit in English aristocratic history of entailing the inheritance of great estates down the male line. And if someone just had daughters, as often happens in Jane Austen, and has happened in Downton Abbey, the line of the inheritance passes to the nearest male in the family. Well, it so happens that the nearest male in the family at the beginning of Downton Abbey is on the Titanic. And just in case you might turn to his brother is also on the Titanic. And they both go down with the ship. So the question becomes, what's Lady Mary going to do now? There's this expectation that she will marry in some way that will keep the inheritance in the family, even though it doesn't pass directly to her. And so when it turns out that the other relative, the other male relative, is this middle-class lawyer, Matthew Crawley, then the question becomes, well, should Mary marry Matthew or not? And at first, it seems quite unlikely. All of that is set in motion by the sinking of the Titanic. But the Titanic is symbolic beyond that, because for many, the sinking of the Titanic had quite a significance in the whole arc of European and even American history, because the Titanic was thought of as a very confident, powerful structure that would somehow keep the old world and the new world together even as change happened. It was a place where certain old world structures, like the class structure, could be preserved, with those who had the highest class cabins and those who had to travel in steerage from the working class. And yet, all of this new technology would allow greater speed and power of travel between England and America in this case. So the idea was it would unite the old with the new, with an unsinkable technology. But when the ship sank, for many, this sinking betokened the death of the old world, particularly because of the outrage that so many people in steerage died, while so many people on the upper decks, percentage-wise, lived. And there was the sense that the old world was dying, and it was being taken down by the uncontrollability and unpredictability of the new, which in England was associated with America, where the Titanic was traveling to. And of course, Downton Abbey picks up on that. The basic financial structure that allows the estate to be what it is, used to be based on tenant farmers. Well, that economy has long since gone. Lord Robert has had to marry an American heiress to keep the fortune behind Downton Abbey going, as did many aristocrats at the time in Britain. That is, in fact, an historical fact. And so the interplay between England and America and the need of the new to support the old and the fear that the old is dying because of the support and technology of the new was all symbolized by the Titanic and is deeply rooted in the whole dramatic drive of Downton Abbey, partly because it uses the Titanic as a beginning point. Now, this was not totally original with Downton Abbey. If many of you may remember who watched Upstairs, Downstairs, that used the Titanic too, except it came at the end of the first season, when Lady Marjorie, the lady of the house, chooses to take a voyage to America, and it happens to be on the Titanic. That ended the first season. This begins Downton Abbey itself, and all of this symbolism goes with it. And I think you can see it in the very logo that the Downton Abbey producers and advertisers choose to use. Granted, that house above the shadow and then the house below has to do, of course, with the upstairs, downstairs quality of the house. Those who are above stairs, who are the aristocrats, and those who are the working classes working below stairs. But there is also the sense that Downton Abbey is in danger of sinking at every moment. The financial structure behind it, the solidity of the class structure that upholds it, all of that is very creaky and in the process of falling apart. It has to be shored up with all kinds of extra efforts. And the staff itself, while the butler tries to keep them all unified to one purpose, is actually a mixture of individuals who are in danger of going off in many directions. So what the Titanic symbolized is also symbolized in Downton Abbey itself, and I think it's reflected in that logo. And all of this, the death of the old and the coming of the new, and what you're going to do with both, was only reinforced by the coming of World War I from 1914 to 1918, and the in-betweenness of those people connected to it in the trenches and at home. Because after World War I, nothing was the same. And so much of the old world had died, and there was so much uncertainty about what the new world would bring after the war, and how much was left of the fragments of the old. This is really, I think, a very powerful way of pulling history into fiction, combining the significance of the Titanic and the significance of World War I, and making them the very heart of the plot drive and the dramatic tension in Downton Abbey itself. Now, there were some other events. One of them following right upon World War I that the series makes a lot of. If the results of the Titanic and the coming of World War I dominate season 1, season 2 of Downton Abbey involves, of course, the war itself, and members of both the upstairs and the downstairs going off to war, some of them returning better off than others. But things happening that were brought back from the war that affect the home front. And one of them, which has been little known in history until Downton and other fictions have revived interest in it, is the Spanish Influenza, or the Spanish flu, that really took over the whole European and Western world, really, in 1918, the year that the war was supposedly coming to an end. The Spanish influenza was thought at the time to have originated in Spain, but research since then indicates that that probably is not true. It's hard to pinpoint the exact origin. But it came from germs that particularly festered and expanded when men at war were forced closely together. And it first appeared in force, a very ravaging disease with terrible consequences for your respiratory system, for your heart, for coughing up blood. It was really an awful, awful disease. It appeared in January in force in 1918 at Fort Riley, Kansas. Not in Spain, but in Fort Riley, Kansas. And this is a picture of what Fort Riley, Kansas turned into within the space of months. Building after building was a hospital where soldiers were very sick and dying. And the death rate at Fort Riley, Kansas, for anybody who caught it, was about 85%. It was a ravaging, horrible disease. And it turns out that the closeness of soldiers to each other and their low resistance to any kind of germs, because of the conditions in which they were living, encouraged the disease to develop among soldiers and become contagious among soldiers more than any other group, which is why when they return home to their places of origin or go to places like Downton Abbey that were turned into convalescent hospitals, as in fact many of the country estates were, they carry the disease with them. And that's what happens in season 2 of Downton Abbey. Because, yes, Matthew comes home and he's wounded and he's sick, and we don't know whether he's going to survive. Other soldiers begin to show manifestations of the disease. The disease spreads to some of both the upstairs and the downstairs characters. And Lavinia Swire, the woman that Matthew has proposed to and is going to marry, really catches the disease and dies of it, while Matthew miraculously recovers. Now, critics of Downton Abbey have said, that's a little too easy, because the author is aware, as in a Jane Austen novel, that we want Mary and Matthew to get together. And there has to be some way of removing the very lovely and the very nice obstacle that is Lavinia Squire. What better way, if you're going to use history like this, than the Spanish influenza? And there's a certain historical accuracy even to that, because the Spanish influenza most greatly affected those from their 20s to their 50s. You notice the older characters in Downton Abbey didn't get the Spanish influenza. The doctor, the great country doctor, who is Dr. Clarkson, who is taking care of all these patients, never gets any of the symptoms. And that was true of the way the disease progressed. It seemed to affect people of soldiering age, unfortunately, from their 20s to their 50s. And it was those, like Lavinia, who died of it when they were exposed to it and caught it. Far more so than children or senior citizens who seemed to be mysteriously immune. So again, that's an intriguing use of an actual historical fact that supports the validity of who dies and who doesn't, unless you want to say, well, it was just too easy that it's Lavinia, so that Matthew could have Mary. That's still being argued by fans and critics of Downton Abbey today. Also in season 2, Mary, who is still separated from Matthew, at odds with Matthew, knowing that Matthew is now engaged to Lavinia, feels forced to seek out some other husband who will help shore up the fortunes of the family. And for a while, she's courted by and agrees to keep some company with Sir Richard Carlisle, who is played by Ian Glenn, who has been in many other British series as well. And of course, we don't really like Sir Richard Carlisle. He is, after all, an upstart, not a true aristocrat. He made a huge amount of money as a newspaper magnate. We tend to think of him as a kind of Donald Trump, speaking of parallels to the present time. But we're not exactly sure how shady he is and how much Lady Mary should stay away from him. Well, the coup de grace comes from historical fact being used, because it turns out that very secretly, and we gradually find out, Sir Richard has been involved in the Marconi scandal. It turns out, and this was gradually discovered over a period of years, not just initially, that highly placed members of the Liberal government under Prime Minister Asquith, starting in 1912, the year the series started, had profited by insider trading information, we would call it that today, on the government's intention to issue a lucrative contract to the British Marconi Company, named after the Italian inventor Marconi, to set up the Imperial Wireless Chain, which is an ancestor of wireless today, something that set up the possibility of electrical messages being sent across waves rather than across wires. And that possibility was going to, and indeed did, transform communication in Britain, Europe, and America. And some members of the government knew this was going to happen, and so they bought shares. But they did it surreptitiously, not by buying them in the English subsidiary, but in the American subsidiary of that company, hiding their money, as it were, offshore in the United States. And gradually this came out, that members of the government and people close to the government were involved in this, and the scandal kind of erupted in bits and pieces across the 19-teens while the war was going on. And Sir Richard turns out to be guilty in this scandal by both profiting himself, because he is one of these secret investors, and by keeping it secret, which is the very antithesis of what he should do as a newspaperman, but also bound up with the fact that he is a money-grubbing social climber who has used any means he could to attain the kind of fabulous property equivalent to Downton Abbey that he wants to offer Lady Mary. And of course, he wants to connect himself with the aristocracy by marrying her and solidifying the connection. But underneath this, as in the time, lay the corruption of the Marconi scandal, which embraced many aristocrats and high public officials by the time all of the discoveries came out. And then there's what happens in season 3. In season 3, we are reminded of the fact that the financing, the undergirding, the economic infrastructure behind Downton Abbey is very tenuous. And again, it's in danger of sinking all the time. And we find out that Robert Crawley, Lord Grantham, played by Hugh Bonneville, has invested even his wife's money, which they were trying to preserve for Lady Mary and thought they were preserving for Lady Mary, in the Grand Trunk Line of Canada. Now, why did they choose the Grand Trunk Line of Canada? Well, it turns out there was an historically real trunk line and a real problem with it at the time. The connection may have come from the fact that the president of the Canadian Grand Trunk Line, the one who built it into the force that it was before this investment, was in fact lost on the Titanic in 1912. And after that, his successors tried to expand the line across North America with much greater rapidity than it turned out the financing and the labor could handle. And so lots of investment poured in from all over the world, and the building couldn't keep up with the prospects. And so much of that investment ended up being lost, and the line was declared bankrupt in 1919. And with it went a lot of the investors' money that was shoring it up from all over the world, including the money we're to believe, invested by Robert Lord Grantham. And so this emphasizes what the series has really always been about. And so the series kind of returns to its unstable roots at the beginning of season 3. The long-standing problem of still funding these big estates. Because the idea that they rested on some firm foundation of economic development was completely false. They had to be shored up with immense amounts of money from American fortunes, from investments, from all kinds of sales of property that they owned in other parts of England. So this peaceful estate that you see actually has this underpinning of unsettled economic wearing away. And that's very much emphasized by the use of the Canadian trunk line, which really did go bankrupt, especially between 1919 and 1920, and carried away a great many aristocratic and other fortunes with it. So there is the possibility that, God forbid, they're going to have to sell and leave Downton Abbey. Oh my God. Oh my God. Now people have argued that, as in season 2, they get out of this a little easily because Matthew has been left some money by, of all people, the parents of Lavinia, about whom he feels very guilty. Because not only did she die while she was still his fiancée, but she saw him and Mary together, dancing together, and it was clear to her what was going on, and he wonders if that helped bring on the disease. So he feels very guilty, and so he's reluctant to accept this money, but finally is persuaded to do so, and that fortune, since he's the heir, is poured into Downton Abbey, which Matthew agrees to co-manage in a more middle-class and modern way. And so the problem caused by the Grand Trunk Railway system vanishes rather quickly. And people have debated about the validity of that. But there's no questioning the historical accuracy of what happened to the Canadian Grand Trunk Line in 1919 and 1920. Now, another character that becomes more prominent, especially in season 3, is Tom Branson, played by Alan Leach. He is, of course, the family's chauffeur, and falls in love with the youngest daughter of the family, Lady Sybil, played by Jessica Brown Findlay. And this poster during that scene was very prominent in England, as you might imagine. And a couple of years before that, even before he was playing this part, Alan Leach was voted in a London newspaper poll to be the sexiest young actor in England, which may have been one reason he was hired. But the way he is scripted, he plays a very serious individual indeed. Yes, he falls in love with Lady Sybil, but he's Irish to the core, and he brings all of the issues of what was going on in Ireland right to the doorsteps of Downton Abbey. Oh, he brings other clash issues as well. The idea that the chauffeur could marry one of the ladies of the house is, of course, a challenge to the whole class structure. But then once he marries her, should he be admitted into the family properly or not? And even Lady Violet has to admit that maybe he should be, except that in things like how to dress and so on, he's got to obey her. But the more serious side still comes in, because he reminds the house of all of the terrible things that are going on in Ireland at the time, and the effort of the Irish to break free of English dominance that really accelerated at this time. It was particularly encouraged, and there was a lot of writing about this at the time, a lot of controversy about it in England, by the rebellion of 1916, in which the Irish Republican Army and affiliates of it first came in to its greatest prominence. And this painting reflects a lot of the violence that took place with the attempted overthrow of the British-based Irish government in 1916. And from that time on, the IRA waged first a subtle and then an open war. From 1919 to 1921, the IRA was in full cry and launching attacks in England, launching attacks in Northern Ireland, launching attacks in parts of Ireland itself. And at one point, Tom Branson, after he and Lady Sybil get married, go back to Ireland and are mysteriously involved in the IRA blowing up of a building. And the question is, since he's a journalist, how much is he really associated with the IRA and how much is he just reporting on it? And it turns out he's given a much darker brother, a drunken brother, who tends to be more associated with the IRA than he is, so the association isn't as bad as it might have been. But he still brings to Downton Abbey an expression of these sentiments and causes that whole debate to be restaged, at least in words, in the very dining halls of Downton Abbey itself. And the Treaty of 1821, which he does talk about at one point, that was worked out to stop a lot of this fighting, completed the split between Southern and Northern Ireland, where Southern Ireland became the Irish Free State that we still know today, and even eventually adopted Celtic as its co-main language, and left Northern Ireland under British rule. And there are tensions about that, of course, that still exist today, even if some of the violence and fervid disagreements of this time have settled down. So there's an expectation that the importance and problem of the Irish conflict is brought into Downton Abbey and resonates there at every point. Now we have to see, with the death of Lady Sybil, how Tom Branson adjusts to being a substitute for Matthew, the manager of the estate. And how is he going to feel about supporting this old aristocratic structure after this kind of social and political background? Stay tuned. And of course, there is the fact that outraged so many people in season 3 that Lady Sybil dies in childbirth. Now, because of things like the death of Lavinia, the convenient death of Lavinia in season 2, there were people who criticized Downton Abbey for making things too easy. And one gets the sense that Julian Fellowes, the main author of the scripts, decided, all right, if you think things have happened too easily, wait till season 3. Because season 3 gives us not one death, right, but 2. And the first, and most wrenching and drawn out, is the death of Lady Sybil just after the birth of their baby, their daughter, little Sybil, as she comes to be called, of eclampsia. And that was a very, very real problem at the time. Eclampsia comes from a Greek word for shining forth, and that's very appropriate because there are symptoms indicated on the outside of the body of what's going on the inside. It is an acute and life-threatening complication of pregnancy that involves the onset of tonic-clonic seizures, especially in the brain, usually in a patient who has developed preeclampsia. Now, preeclampsia has certain distinctive symptoms. One is the rise in blood pressure, increased hypertension. One is a condition also known as proteinuria, which is the rise of a high level of serum proteins in the urine. And another is an unusually large placenta. Well, in Downton Abbey, season 3, Dr. Clarkson, the country doctor, notices these things. But the family is still so devoted to the traditional medicine practiced by these great London doctors of the city that it relies more on them than on Dr. Clarkson himself. And Dr. Clarkson understands more of the symptoms of preeclampsia. But because the family disregards him and won't take as immediate action as he advises, they believe instead in the older aristocratically associated doctor who is not as really up on medical science as Dr. Clarkson. And the result is disastrous. And she dies of eclampsia, as Dr. Clarkson says, after the birth of their child. And that's historically accurate. There were many more deaths by eclampsia in the 1920s than there were in the 1930s and after. And that's because an American doctor, I don't know whether this is going to be brought up in this British series or not, But an American doctor began to prevent such seizures successfully by treating preeclampsia with magnesium sulfate in the early 1930s, and that greatly reduced the instances of death from eclampsia. But that kind of medical technology had not yet been developed at the time this story takes place. Now, one of the things that Downton Abbey has not done so much in practicing the techniques of historical fiction is associating its characters very much with real people. And again, Julian Fellowes seems to know how to react to criticism. So he says, well, if you think we haven't brought enough real people in, wait till season 4. Because in season 4, we are going to get many more real figures of the time associating with the fictional characters upstairs and downstairs of Downton Abbey. One of them you will see was a woman named, best known as Nellie Melba, who was in fact an Australian soprano of great operatic note. Unable to really have a full career in Australia, she migrated to England, and not so successful there initially, migrated to Europe, and eventually became the toast of some of the big opera houses in Europe. After she achieved that success, she came back to England and was very influential in raising money for the troops, the English troops, during World War I. And in the 1920s, when season 4 takes place, she was, the real Nellie Melba, on a series of farewell tours. She had many farewell tours because her voice held up reasonably well across that decade. And so she would have been expected to sing in grand country houses and other places. And she does come as a house guest to Downton Abbey. And she is played by, will be played by, as we will see it, the great New Zealand soprano, Dame Kiri Te Kanawa, during season 4. And we are also going to meet in season 4 Virginia Woolf. Because Lady Edith, the younger sister of the family, who was always kept behind Lady Mary somehow, is starting to find her own way and to liberate herself from some of the traditions of her family. And she's becoming a writer. And she's becoming associated with a magazine publisher and editor, and gradually involved romantically with him. So she starts being drawn into the circles of London writers, particularly in season 4, into the Bloomsbury group, where we find Virginia Woolf, who is going to appear in the series and is played by the English actress Christina Carty. And we'll have to see how they develop that side of Lady Edith's career as her liberation from the past is accelerated by this series of associations. So just when you think that Julian Fellowes has forgotten one of the conventions of historical fiction, he's going to restore it with a vengeance, and hopefully to good effect in season 4 of Downton Abbey that's coming right up. Now, let's consider for a moment the 4th convention of historical fiction that I mentioned before. The idea that when you look at a particular historical time and try to present it in terms of the known historical facts at that time, you do it in fiction, because in that way you engage in a dialogue between the issues of that time and the issues of our time, in this case, which find themselves to be surprisingly in dialogue with the kinds of things that are going on in the 19-teens and 20s in and around Downton Abbey. So that raises the question, as we look at the whole cast here from season 3, is that great time of change so different from our time of change? Well, think about it. There's a cataclysmic event that changes the world and makes us wonder what the future of the world, whole world, is going to be in the sinking of the Titanic. And let's face it, in September 11th, 2001. And the economy of the world is changing so rapidly that many people don't know what the economic basis of America, Europe, the West, is really going to be. And there has been an economic upheaval and a loss of money and fortune to an extent as great or greater than what we see in the 19 teens and 20s at Downton Abbey. So even though we may not be aristocrats, we can imagine ourselves or working class in the sense that the lower orders below stairs are. We can imagine ourselves in this situation of change where we literally feel we don't know what's going to happen next, and that what's next could be liberating. What's next could be aspects of a better world, or it could be a world more destructive. We're kind of on the edge, and we don't know which way it's going to go. And we have what we have in Washington, D.C., right? Where different social orders and their ideologies are at odds with each other so completely that it's like they're bulls pushing against each other. Well, you see some of that in Downton Abbey as well. So it tempts us to engage in a dialogue with its time because in the way the fiction uses history, it raises issues that we are playing out now, but in the terms of the 19 teens and 20s. And we can choose to either think about those issues in comparative terms, or to say, well, all that happened in another time and in another place, and I don't need to be concerned about it. We can escape in Downton Abbey, or we can confront the issues that Downton Abbey raises. And that's true, I would say, of historical fiction generally throughout its more than 200-year tradition that Downton Abbey repeats so powerfully. And think about it in smaller terms. Technology is changing so fast, we hardly know what one thing is before another thing replaces it. And we keep asking ourselves questions. What's an iPad? Well, I mean, a few years ago, 15 years ago, people were exchanging floppy disks all over the university. You know, people would come up and say, would you like my floppy? And you used to be able to get arrested when you said that. But in that time, it made perfect sense. Now it's a complete anachronism. You know, we have jump drives, like I have here, flash drives. And 10 years ago, one would have said, what's that? Give me my floppy. You know? So we really have to sympathize with Lady Violet when she asks questions like this. I mean, remember when Matthew first comes to Downton Abbey and says, well, I can only make it down here on the weekends. She says, what's a weekend? It's incomprehensible to her. And so the idea that there aren't specific kinds of tea that stay rigorously separate the way the classes are supposed to is, needless to say, a shock to the system. But that's a kind of a small version of the situation in which we may find ourselves now. We're asking these questions about things that are changing so fast we can hardly comprehend them. And we wonder if the changes that are coming are destructive or constructive. And that tension, that deep historical tension, is at the heart of Downton Abbey. And it fulfills the functions of historical fiction to engage us in issues now by pointing to similar issues back then. Thank you.